It's my pleasure at this time to introduce a close friend to the museum, Dr. Julian M. Pleasance. He received his Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1971 and his M.A. from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1962. Joined the faculty of the University of Florida in 1969, where he is the director of the Proctor Oral History Program. His areas of interest include 20th century U.S. history and Southern history, the New Deal period, Southern and Florida politics, and Florida newspapers. Dr. Pleasance has received numerous professional and teaching, as well as community awards, and has had numerous articles published. His books include Hanging Chads, the inside story of the 2000 presidential recount in Florida, and Gator Tales, an oral history of the University of Florida. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Julian Pleasance. It's been a long couple of years in coming. Dr. Pleasance.
Thank you, Bill. I want to welcome everyone to the afternoon session on Stalingrad and Berlin, researching the reality of war. And we're very fortunate in having two very distinguished historians to appear for us today. And I want to give you briefly how we're planning the session. Professor Beaver will talk about 45 minutes. Professor Bartov will then comment on his paper for about 25 minutes, and then we will open the floor for discussion and questions. Professor Beaver is a distinguished historian who was educated at Sandhurst and studied under the distinguished John Keegan. He served in the British Army. He has published 4 novels. He has published 8 works of nonfiction. Stalingrad is a book published in 1998, which has now been translated into 25 languages. It is and has been a #1 bestseller, along with his other book, Berlin, The Downfall, 1945. These 2 books collectively have sold almost 2.5 million copies, which is extraordinary for an academic. It's even good for John Grisham. One comment I wanted to make about Stalingrad, and I'd like to quote John Keegan: "Certainly the best narrative of the battle yet to appear, not likely to be surpassed in our time." High praise indeed. And the second book, The Fall of Berlin, a terrible story of pride, stupidity, fanaticism, revenge, but also a tale of endurance and courage and survival. It is a conflict between 2 of the greatest egos of the 20th century, Joseph Stalin and, of course, Adolf Hitler. So I welcome to the podium Professor Anthony Beaver.
Thank you very much. In January 1945, the Red Army launched its great winter offensive from the River Vistula. Its ultimate objective was Berlin, what Soviet propaganda called the lair of the fascist beast. In the city itself, the mood was a mixture of fear, resignation, uncertainty, and cynicism. Already at Christmas, the famous black humor of Berliners had turned to gallows humor. The joke that season was, "Be practical, give a coffin." The question dominating their minds was which enemy would reach Berlin first, the Western Allies or the Soviets, and Berliners remarked that optimists were learning English and pessimists were learning Russian. Nazi diehards had suddenly become a minority. They felt betrayed by the fair-weather supporters of Hitler, who now tried rapidly to distance themselves from the regime and responsibility for its actions. The question of how deeply Germans were committed to Hitler at particular moments has dogged the post-war debate for decades. When I was down in Bavaria researching Stalingrad, I contacted Reinhard Spitzi. Spitzi had been Ribbentrop's most energetic aide in London and Berlin, and I'd heard of his reputation for straight speaking. His memoirs bear the remarkable title, How We Squandered the Reich, and there was no beating about the bush with him. I'm sure, he told me, that most of those you have spoken to pretended that they were never Nazis. Well, it's not true. We were all Nazis. Albert Speer, when interrogated by American counterintelligence corps some days after the end of the war, made a bitter observation. History always emphasizes terminal events, he said at that time. Speer hated the idea that what he saw as the early achievements of Hitler's regime would be obscured by its final grotesque collapse. He simply refused to recognize that nothing reveals more about the true nature of a dictatorship than the manner of its downfall. No country has probably done more to face up to the horrors of its own past than Germany. Since the early 1970s, German students have been openly critical of their parents' failure to oppose or condemn the Nazi regime. And the younger generation of German historians has done much to uncover evidence of SS or Wehrmacht atrocities during the invasion of the Soviet Union. The strength of feeling of moral outrage was sometimes so strong that it didn't necessarily make for good history. It's easy to jump to moral judgment in retrospect, even when beating your own national breast. But what is far harder and far more important is to understand the mentality and the context of the times which led to such atrocities. The problem of retrospective assessment based on the values of today rather than those of the period is an important one. The historian Norman Davies has coined the term psychoanachronism for this phenomenon. In any case, nothing is entirely black and white in history and nothing is tidy. The standard question, how could Germany, the country of Schiller and Beethoven and Goethe, have committed such barbarities, is a misleading one. Rather, more to the point, is how did a country desperate for security and law and order in the 1920s and 1930s blindly follow the most reckless criminal that the world has ever seen? The very short answer is that a need to believe in a strong leader can convert otherwise intelligent people to willful blindness and a refusal to pose pertinent questions about where such men will lead them step by step. The story of the last 6 months of the war, culminating in the Red Army's fearsome assault on Berlin, is also the story of an increasing proportion of unwilling soldiers and civilians trapped in a nightmare of Nazi creation. Hitler's refusal to allow retreat meant that German women and children were abandoned in the face of the Red Army. At times, it's hard to distinguish between the Nazis' almost unbelievable irresponsibility and their total lack of humanity, even towards their own people. In the course of just 10 weeks, from mid-January 1945, 8.5 million refugees fled from East Prussia, West Prussia, Pomerania and Silesia by ship, by train, by farm cart and on foot through deep snow. Soviet tank units simply crushed refugee columns under their tracks if they were in the way. Estimates of those who died or were killed range from 500,000 even up to 2 million people. In Germany itself, thousands of refugees were left by the Nazi authorities to freeze and starve in trainloads in cattle and coal wagons like concentration camp prisoners. This was mainly because local Nazi officials did not want the refugees to pass on diseases. In some cases, they simply shirked the responsibility of looking after them and sent them further on down the line. So much for the Nazis' vaunted Volksgenossenschaft, or sense of national comradeship. It is doubly unsettling to read these documents in Berlin, in the main archive in the Finkenstein Allee. The archive is housed in the old barracks of Hitler's bodyguard, the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and you cross their parade grounds to get to the reading rooms. Dealing with German archives is a very straightforward process, little different to archives here or in the United Kingdom. Russian archives, on the other hand, are a far more complex matter. My first attempts in 1995 to get access to the Red Army Stalingrad files held at Zamo, the Russian Ministry of Defense Central Archives out of Podolsk, some 30 kilometers south of Moscow, was quite an education. Zamo was set up in 1936, coincidentally at the start of the purges, and some of the atmosphere still lingers, like the portraits of Lenin gazing down with a sinister gaze from the wall. Our negotiations over access the previous year being conducted with the Ministry of Defense in Moscow and the responsible officer on the General Staff, which directly controls the archives. He told me flatly that the way the system worked was for me to tell them my subject and that they would then select the files. It would have been futile to protest. I explained that I was interested in depicting, as you knew, the experience of soldiers on both sides during the Battle of Stalingrad, and to give an indication of the sort of material I was looking for, I mentioned the interesting reports by doctors and chaplains attached to the German divisions, which I'd found in the German archives at Freiburg. This prompted a bellow of laughter from the Russian colonel. "No priests in the Red Army." Well, yes, I said, but you had political officers. This provoked less of a laugh. So you want to see the political department files, we will see. Well, anyway, I arrived at Podolsk on the first morning, this was the following May, in good time, accompanied by Dr. Luba Vinogradova, my Russian research assistant, and also Max Hastings is, with whom I've now worked for 11 years. Colonel Shuvashin, then the deputy director, showed us the mountain of files that they'd extracted and selected for me. Pieces of paper marked the passages chosen for us, and the typed summary made sure that it was clearly forbidden for us to look outside the marked pages. Anyway, we started off in the most extraordinary circumstances or conditions I've ever encountered in any archive. We had to sit on the far side of Colonel Shuvashin's desk while he bellowed into the malfunctioning telephone. In fact, he pointed at the instrument in frustration and said, "Soviet 1960s model of easier to shout to Moscow." But anyway, just to be on the safe side, I decided that we should start with dossiers which I knew would not be controversial or unsettling from the Russian point of view. And this proved a fortunate choice. At the end of the morning, a man appeared in dark glasses, a beach shirt, and a moustache. It was wonderful May weather, I hasten to add. And he had rather a menacing friendliness and spoke such good English that it could have only been learnt abroad. And I discovered later that his name was Colonel Gregor Yurovich Starkov, and even I, the most inexperienced of spook spotters, could see GRU written all over him. Shuvashin also seemed nervous as Starkov questioned me on my approach to the subject, expressing the hope that I was not interested in negative material. I tried to duck this with a deliberately boring treatise on a historian's duty of objectivity, but this cut no ice whatsoever. And Colonel Starkov then told us that it was time for lunch and directed Luba and me to the canteen out of the building and down the road and said we should leave all our bags and papers in the office. So not much subtlety there. But in the afternoon, to our astonishment, everything was very relaxed. Presumably, Colonel Starkov had found nothing anti-Soviet in our notes. And to our astonishment, we were given a lecture room to work in just down the hall, completely unsupervised. And we then started on the daily reports, up to 20 pages per day, sent by the political department of the Stalingrad front to Alexander Shcherbakov, the chief commissar of the Red Army in Moscow. Once over our initial euphoria at getting to the unvarnished truth, we realized that we had to be very careful. Luba stuck her finger in one of the permitted passages, and every time we heard footsteps in the corridor, she flipped back. Felt a bit like cheating in an exam. The pages selected for us consisted mainly of letters of praise addressed to Comrade Stalin by soldiers at the front. The rest, though, was exactly what I'd been looking for. A detailed record, day by day, without any propaganda gloss. They described the acts of genuine heroism, but also the extraordinary events, which was commissar speak for desertions, self-inflicted injuries, drunkenness of commanders, alcohol poisoning of soldiers, defeatism, and all other crimes punishable by death. Story after story put terrible flesh on the figure of 13,500 Red Army soldiers executed at Stalingrad by their own side. I was staying with a Canadian political attaché in his apartment, and on the first evening, when I rang my wife back in London to tell her I couldn't believe that we'd been allowed near this material unsupervised, I suddenly found my host was signaling urgently to me to shut up, and one forgot, of course, even in the new Moscow, that certain old Soviet habits hadn't stopped. Anyway, Luba and I spent the rest of the week flipping back to the handful of permitted pages whenever we heard footsteps. But then Colonel Shuvashin and the woman archivist started, by the end of the week, to get a bit nervous, we noticed, and they must have finally worked out that we'd taken an unusually long time to go through files in which we're supposed to read only a few dozen pages. And they were even more uneasy on the Monday morning when, sure enough, Colonel Starkov appeared a few minutes later. And then there followed another interrogation with no pretense of friendliness. After Starkov's departure, Shuvashin, who'd accompanied out, then came back into the room and said they'd have to inspect all my handwritten notes. So in an attempt to calm their suspicions, I obviously said, of course I'll do that, but I even offered to decipher my appalling handwriting if they wanted with one of their interpreters. But I knew they'd had to bring down their interpreters from Moscow, which is about a 2-hour journey each day. So I suggested that perhaps we could go through all of the notebooks at the end of the week and all the rest of it. And Shuvashin seemed quite relieved at that. Anyway, one of the lessons, of course, I'd learnt in the Russian archives was you wanted to have the wire-spined notebooks, because then you can rip out the pages without it showing what pages are missing. So I, in fact, had to remove a number of pages, but I then found there weren't really very many. And that night, as I was sort of trying to rework it, I suddenly wondered, I was almost tempted to start composing letters of loyalty to Comrade Stalin and myself to bulk it out a bit, but anyway. Anyway, on the very last morning, the GRU major appeared in uniform, and it was quite interesting. In a friendlier manner than Starkov, he asked me whether I was writing a novel. Well, anyway, it wasn't hard to guess his line of approach. I said, no, I was writing a work of history. How then, he asked, since I was taking handwritten notes and not photocopies, could I prove the authenticity of my sources? Well, I said, as you would see, I was recording the font, description, and file and page reference of every single quotation. So if any other historian was dubious about what I'd written, they had a precise reference for checking. This wasn't a very popular answer. And anyway, he spent the whole of the day going through the notes, and in the afternoon, another officer turned up and, of course, checked exactly the same stuff in the sort of old-fashioned Soviet double check. But he also gave it the all clear. And actually, even Shuvashin seemed sort of relieved at the outcome. I, meanwhile, felt secretly elated, as if, I had passed the exam. But when I got back to the apartment, my Canadian host warned me that there was a very small risk that the military authorities might suddenly have second thoughts and search me at the airport, confiscating my notes. So he took me into the Canadian embassy the following morning before my flight, and we photocopied every page to leave a spare copy there. In the event, there was no problem. But anyway, there ended my only brush with the world of John le Carré. I returned to the Russian military archives again 3 years later for research on the next book, The Fall of Berlin. I didn't dare believe that we'd actually be allowed back in again, because already there'd been certain tightening up of the archives even at that particular stage. But eventually I was, and Colonel Shuvashin by then was the director, and outwardly he was very affable and much more relaxed. But I knew that very little had changed except presentation when he said, we would like to see ourselves in a way as co-authors of your book. Well, you can imagine my smile at that idea. One of his colleagues then said that they'd like to see how I'd use the material from their archive on Stalingrad, but thank goodness my Russian publishers had taken a very, very long time producing the book, and it hadn't yet appeared in Russian. So I was able to say, oh, well, you'll soon be able to see it in a Russian version. Anyway, this time, Luba and I were allocated a permanent supervisor called Allah, who was supposed to stay with us the whole time to make sure that we didn't look at any pages outside the allotted ones. For the first 2 days, we went through those particular sections while she yawned her way through crossword puzzles. We wondered how on earth we might get rid of her. Luba even whispered to me rather naughtily that I should give her a box of chocolates injected with laxative, but I might have been accused of sabotaging military personnel. Anyway, luckily for us, our watchdog became bored of her crossword puzzle after a day or two, and she started playing a version of Grandmother's Footsteps with us, leaving us alone for a few minutes, then coming back on tiptoe and suddenly opening the door to see whether we looked guilty or not. But then, fortunately, she went shopping, and because we could see from the window of the archive block where we were sitting that we suddenly saw her go out of the main gate. She had a very bright pink shopping bag. But anyway, from then on, I sat facing the window while Luba worked very rapidly through the forbidden material. But unfortunately, later on, she did come in back one afternoon and obviously caught us. And we did look certainly shifty. But I had, thank goodness, on every occasion, kept on ripping out the pages from the illegal stuff and putting it in a trouser pocket. Anyway, but the point was that they insisted on seeing again every single notebook. And some of the pages were actually ripped up in front of our faces by one of the officers saying, this was in fact a reference to Red Army officers being accused of rape, saying you can write that any culprits found guilty were punished. Well, anyway, we knew perfectly well that that was not the truth, both from Soviet and German sources. Anyway, the lesson is that there's no point becoming frustrated over what you cannot get at. You simply have to keep going for everything possible while you have the chance. And as was mentioned the other day, one of the terrifying things, my Professor Weinberg, one of the terrifying things, especially in the Russian archives, is the way that the paper is simply falling to pieces. They haven't got the money to do much microfilms. Thank God the Hoover Institute did all the work they did, but that was mainly in the political archives. But in the military archives, this stuff is just falling to pieces. And I mean, however carefully you turn over the pages, you still see this sort of pile of sort of broken yellowed paper. But anyway, as I was saying, the lesson is we've got to keep going. But sadly, that half-open window, I was incredibly lucky on timing, has already started to close again. I mean, not long after we finished the research on Berlin, a Swedish historian, Lennart Samuelsson, rang me to ask whether I'd heard that the FSB, the old KGB, was now checking the archive registers on every single file taken out by a foreign historian. And then a few months later, Catherine Meredale, who'd been working there, rang me to say that the information on the files, in fact, is now being cross-referenced on a computer. And most of these archives didn't even have a computer for their catalogue. And also I heard, in fact, that the Secret Committee on the Control of Information, which was abolished in 1983, 6 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall, has actually been reactivated again without any public announcement. The battle for Berlin in April and the beginning of May 1945 was the long-predicted climax of the war on the Eastern Front. But once again, thousands died for vain symbols on both sides. 2 Red Army divisions were thrown at that massive and impregnable, well-defended building, the Reichstag, to raise the red banner of victory. And on the German side, Hitler, a devotee of the cinema, must have visualized his Goethe-Dämmerung in Berlin amid blazing monuments crashing down. In fact, Albert Speer had agreed with Hitler at their very last meeting that the fall of Berchtesgaden didn't have quite the same dramatic quality as the fall of Berlin. War between the 2 totalitarian states of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was not just a war of ideologies, it was also a war between 2 monstrous vanities. But the point of writing a new book, another book yet unknown on such a well-known subject, was not just to focus on the leaders and commanders. It had to rediscover the experience of the individual caught up in this terrifying and mad maelstrom. So once again, I didn't just want headquarters war diaries and logs, but also the letters home from ordinary soldiers, private diaries, and reports of prisoner interrogation, doctors' accounts, and so forth. In the case of Stalingrad, there have been huge numbers of letters to choose from. That was not the case, however, for Berlin. The German Feldpost, as well as the internal mail, had more or less collapsed. But fortunately, many people, especially women in Berlin, realized that they were living through one of the key moments in history and kept a minute record of events in private diaries, and several of these are truly outstanding. The interesting question is how history has changed in the last 20-odd years. History, as you know, used to be written in collective terms, the history of a country or of an army or whatever. And this tended to consist of history from above, often describing battles like a game of chess. Then in the 1980s, oral history started to become popular. And this coincided, as you'll remember, with a growing interest in the fate of the individual at a time of increasing individualism. But with huge battles like Stalingrad and Berlin, it was important to integrate history from above with history from below, because only then could you show how the decisions of Stalin in the Kremlin or Hitler in the bunker affected the lives and deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. The downfall in Berlin itself produced a crescendo of insanity and grotesque images. One staff officer described to me the atmosphere in the Führer bunker as a mixture of hysteria and resignation. Another, General Freitag von Loringhofen, who was there until the very end, recounted how SS officers and Nazi leaders spent their time discussing the best way to commit suicide, poison or a bullet to the head. Hitler was handing out cyanide capsules as if they were sweets to be sucked during takeoff for the next world. Hitler's dementia came from a persecution complex and the transcending delusion that he was the incarnation of Germany. The defeated German people did not deserve to survive him, therefore they too should die. The sense of unreality pervaded everything. Even the Führerdämmerung itself, with Hitler and his new bride dressed in black, had its elements of grotesque farce. Hitler's valet Linger managed to steal his master's watch as they bundled his corpse up in a grey army blanket. And when the two bodies were doused in petrol and set on fire in the Reichskanzlei gardens, one of the SS guards who'd been drinking heavily in the canteen and was slightly drunk rushed downstairs and called out to the SS telephonist, "The chief's on fire, do you want to come and have a look?" This telephonist from the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler is called Rokus Misch, and he's still alive. And it was so strange, sitting in his little parlour in Berlin, drinking tea, as he proudly showed us the album full of photographs which he'd taken of Hitler playing with Blondie, his German shepherd dog, at the Wolfschanze headquarters in East Prussia. The grotesque drama continued, but in a different way, after the Reichschancellery was captured by the Red Army on the 2nd of May 1945, and a Smersh detachment under General Vardis took over the bunker. Hitler urgently wanted to know what had become, or Stalin urgently wanted to know what had become of Hitler. Smersh, Soviet counterintelligence, had heard from surrendering German generals and officials that the Nazi leader had committed suicide, but nobody could find the body. Eventually, it was discovered by Smersh operatives on the 5th of May, buried in a shell hole, along with the body of Eva Braun and his adored dog Blondie. But Stalin didn't want anyone to know. Not only did he use this as an opportunity for accusing the Americans of having hid Hitler in Bavaria, he also wanted to put pressure on his own army commanders. He rang Marshal Zhukov on 2 occasions to taunt him with the supposed failure to find Hitler, when he knew all the time that Smersh had already carried out its own autopsy on the body. This may beg a belief, but Marshal Zhukov, the commander-in-chief in Berlin, did not discover for 20 years that Hitler's body had been found, not till 1965. This was all part of the Byzantine world of Stalinist politics. Stalin feared the popularity of Zhukov and later had him accused of Bonapartism. Hitler's corpse, meanwhile, had been examined in every detail. The most certain means of verification were the teeth. The assistant to Hitler's dentist was tracked down in Berlin and brought in to identify the jaws, which had been removed. In Moscow, we interviewed Yelena Rezheskaya, an interpreter with the Smersh detachment in the Reichschancellery. And she told us how, on the evening of the 8th of May, when the Soviet troops went wild celebrating the victory in Berlin, she was given a satin-lined red box, the sort used for cheap jewellery, as she described it. Inside were Hitler's 2 jaws, removed during the secret autopsy. And she was warned by her Smersh supervisor that if they were lost, she would answer with her head. Rezheskaya was, of course, entrusted with these vital artifacts because as a woman she was less likely to get drunk on that evening of celebration and lose them. So she had to spend the evening of victory night with the red box clamped under her left arm while she poured drinks for her Smersh comrades with the right. Other research trips produced strange experiences. With Luber again, I went to Georgia with the BBC to interview more veterans who'd taken part in the battle for Berlin. The most extraordinary character, though, we encountered was Stalin's grandson, Yevgeny Zhukashvili. And we talked to him in Stalin's birthplace in the town of Gori, now a memorial to Stalin. Beria, as a tribute to his chief, raised a quarter of the town in 1951 all around the great helmsman's birthplace, a 2-room hovel. And he created a huge museum and erected a Stalinist oriental marble Parthenon over this Holy of Holies, which is still a place of pilgrimage. And the grandson bears a striking resemblance to the Generalissimo, and he cultivates the look as far as he can go. He'd win any Stalin look-alike competition with the swept-back hair, the moustache, the yellow teeth, and he even holds his cigarette in the same way, quite consciously. When the cameras began to roll and we started to interview him, he made the most extraordinary boast when I asked him about the purges of 1937. Everyone goes on about those purges, he said angrily. But what about the crimes over the previous 20 years? My grandfather did what the country wanted. He really sorted out the Jews. Well, Luba, who's half Jewish, turned to me and said in English, Anthony, can I tell him what I think of him? I said, please not, while the cameras are rolling, just keep him talking, because it was fascinating the way he openly echoed the approach of the Nazi ideologues who claimed that Bolshevism was entirely dominated by the Jews. Afterwards, while Yevgeny Zhugashvili stood on the steps to be photographed with one group of school children after another, Luba and I went to inspect Stalin's wagon-lit coach, and the one in which he'd travelled to the conferences at Yalta and Potsdam. Stalin insisted on choosing places where he could go by train because he was terrified of flying. And he claimed that he was ill at the beginning of 1945 and insisted that Churchill and Roosevelt, who was already ill and close to death, should fly to the Crimea. Anyway, this wagon-lit coach is green with Art Nouveau fittings from its sort of Tsarist construction. And as we were shown Stalin's sleeping quarters, the guide gestured to the adjoining bathroom, saying in a reverential voice, and this is where Comrade Stalin performed his hygienic functions. Well, Luba and I found it very hard to keep a straight face. Anyway, afterwards we had to have lunch with Zhugashvili. He called for vodka and insisted on making one toast after another. And these followed the accepted pattern which we'd found with all Soviet veterans. The first was to international peace, the second was to the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and Great Britain, the third was to the ladies, but then to my horror he insisted on drinking to the Generalissimo. Luba quite rightly refused to raise her glass, but I'm forced to confess that out of British politeness, that masquerade for moral cowardice, I raised my glass with the others to avoid a scene. And it's the only time I've ever drunk to a mass murderer. Luba had remarked to me at one point in Moscow, I think we deserved Stalin. I felt bound to disagree, if only because one can never say that a whole people deserve an appalling leader. It is in any case one of the terrible chicken and egg questions of history, whether leaders like Hitler or Stalin are the product of their country's history or the shaper or both. On many occasions people ask who was the greater criminal, Hitler or Stalin? And in a way it's an interesting philosophical question. Stalin was responsible for more deaths, especially those of his own countrymen and women. But can one say which crime is worse, racial genocide or political class genocide? On the other hand, Andrei Sakharov, the great scientist and Soviet dissident, once observed that although Stalin killed more people, Hitler had to be defeated first, and he was undoubtedly right. A Nazi victory over the Soviet Union in 1941 would have been so terrible that there can be no other answer. In fact, the mass starvation and enslavement which the Nazis planned for the population of the occupied territories all the way up to the Archangel Astrakhan line could have dwarfed even the horrors of the Holocaust. After years of propaganda, it is very hard for Russians to face the implications of their country's past horrors. It means questioning 70 years of terrible sacrifices and countless millions of wasted lives as well as deaths. For Russians, therefore, it is perhaps in a way more difficult to re-examine their history than it is for Germans faced with a 12-year aberration. The Soviet victory in 1945 makes it even harder to question. After accusing me of lies, slander and blasphemy against the Red Army, the Russian ambassador in London later explained to me over lunch why his country found it so hard to question the past. Anton, you must understand the victory is sacred, he was saying. I agreed that the victory was sacred, but in reality it was the vast and terrible human sacrifice which had made it sacred, and much of it in many cases had been wasted. This is why the great majority of Russians have such trouble re-examining the propaganda assumptions of the Great Patriotic War. Often, even the most anti-Stalinist and anti-militarist of them do not find it easy. For example, Luba had some uncomfortable moments in the Moscow archives as we worked together. The hardest, especially for her, came about in the old Marxist-Leninist Institute. We were working through the reports sent to the political department of the Red Army, Glavpurka. And one thick dossier dealt with the subject of Red Army and rape in Germany in 1945. Luba became increasingly uneasy, and when I muttered something at one point, her reaction was both sort of aggressive and defensive at the same time. "Well, Anthony, I'm sorry," she said, "but I refuse to feel sorry for those German women. They must have encouraged their men to invade the Soviet Union and do what they did." I avoided, of course, getting into any sort of argument because I knew how hard it was for her. During the research on Stalingrad at one moment, she'd actually said to me at one moment with only the trace of a joke, "Helping you get this material almost makes me feel like a traitor to the motherland." But then, a few days later, in the same archive, we came across a very detailed report to the Central Committee of the Komsomol, the young Soviet youth, communist youth, from the Deputy Chief of the Political Department of the First Ukrainian Front. This gave chapter and verse detailing the widespread rape of Russian and especially Ukrainian girls and women deported to the Wehrmacht, by the Wehrmacht to Germany for slave labor. These young women, most seemed to be between 17 and 25, had been praying for liberation from their slavery. But then they found to their disbelief and horror that the Red Army treated them as badly or even worse than German women. General Zigankov in this report cited example after example, including groups of officers and soldiers up to 60 strong, most of them drunk, charging into the dormitories where the liberated Soviet girls were quartered and raping them. This was far worse than anything that I'd imagined, and Luba was shaken to the core. We returned to the apartment which she shares with her mother, Galia, in North Moscow, and where I stay whenever I'm in Moscow. And Luba was so upset that she spent most of that night talking to her mother. The next day, I was able to get Galia on her own because I, too, felt a desperate need to understand. And I've always had a huge admiration for her honesty and intelligence. She was a brilliant scientist and won the Stalin Prize for chemistry. And having lived through the post-war terror, she was fascinated by everything we were finding in the archives. Anyway, Galia started to point me in what I think is the right direction, to understand the whole terrifying phenomenon, which I discuss in the book. But I was also greatly helped by the advice and comments of Catherine Merridale, above all, amongst others. The attitudes to the past, though, in Germany, on the other hand, have now reached a new stage. A little bit about this was mentioned already. A notion of Normalisierung, as they're calling it, normalization, has started in Germany. Many, if not most, Germans are taking a different view of the end of the Second World War. They feel that at last it has become acceptable to portray Germans, especially the civilians and victims, alongside other victims of the Nazis. This was partly sparked in 2002 by Günter Grass's new novel, Im Krebsgang, and the book revolves around the fate of refugees from East and West Prussia in the early part of 1945 and the sinking by a Soviet submarine of the liner Wilhelm Gustloff in the Baltic. Over 7,000 refugees, some say 10,000, drowned in the icy waters off the Pomeranian coast. Then, in December of the same year, 2002, the book of the moment was Jörg Friedrich's Der Brand, The Fire, which we've also talked about this morning, a detailed and highly emotive account of the suffering of German civilians under British bombing. It is, of course, quite right that the suffering of German civilians should be acknowledged at long last. It is also right that Germany should be allowed to lay down any burden of collective guilt. But that does not mean that a veil should be drawn over the horrors of the past, or that the laws of cause and effect should be avoided. Over 11 million Germans were ethnically cleansed, but who had started the process, above all, in the so-called Warthegau area of Poland. One must also not underestimate the perils involved if the process of normalization is taken too far, particularly in the case of former Eastern territories, where Germans are buying back their ancestral lands in Silesia and Pomerania, Polish territory since 1945. The Poles and also the Czechs are understandably uneasy at the idea that a political movement might develop in Germany demanding the revision of borders or the restitution of property to the descendants of those forced out in 1945, whether Pomeranians, Silesians, or Sudeten Germans. And then, just a few months ago, a highly controversial exhibition opened in Berlin about the mass expulsion of Germans and the treks of the refugees, their escape. If the European Union is to face up to the problem, it must recognize that you cannot bury extreme nationalism by supranational legislation. That only makes it far more dangerous. To conclude, I'd like to emphasize how vital it is to understand the end of the Second World War in Europe. Not because 1945 marked the start of the Cold War, but because the problems, suspicions, and resentments created then have re-emerged following the collapse of communism. The Cold War, while suppressing nationalist and ethnic conflicts for nearly 50 years, acted in fact rather like a straitjacket, while doing nothing to resolve the problem. Wars between states in Western Europe are mercifully a thing of the past, but old ethnic resentments are not, as we saw in the former Yugoslavia. And also, in an increasingly amorphous world of fragmented societies, there are many young males who largely, through insecurity and frustration, feel a strong need for a tribal or national identity. If the subject of German suffering in 1945 is suppressed, then the extreme right, particularly in the former eastern areas of Germany, will exploit it. Such resentments, if repressed, are made worse. It is far better to show in all possible clarity where nationalist bitterness can lead. Speer, on the other hand, could not have been more wrong. History must emphasize those terminal events which reveal the terrible consequences of grotesque nationalist ideologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that insightful and entertaining address. And to comment on the presentation, we're delighted to have Professor Omar Bartov, who is a distinguished historian as well, author of 6 books, editor of 3 volumes, one of the world's leading experts on genocide. He has won numerous honors in his career, a D.Phil from Oxford University, currently the John Birkeland Distinguished Professor of European History at Brown University. Professor Bartov.
Thank you very much. My role here is to offer a commentary on a very well-crafted and thought-out paper, which puts me in a bit of an uncomfortable position. What I will do is speak about 6 points that refer primarily to the parts in which Anthony Beaver spoke about Germany, an area that I know much more about. I've recently started doing research also in Eastern Europe and share many of the experiences regarding work in Ukrainian and Russian and Polish archives, but I will spare you those stories to another occasion. First point will be on the issue of commitment to Hitler, the German people's commitment to Hitler. The second issue will relate to German barbarities or German crimes. The third will have to do with Germany facing to its past. The fourth will be Germany as victim, or German self-perception as victim. The fifth will be the issue of criminality compared, particularly comparing Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And the last will be the issue of collective guilt and so-called normalization. And obviously, I have 25 minutes for 6 very large topics, so I will have to be quite brief on each of them. Let me start with German commitment to Hitler. Anthony Beaver quotes Ribbentrop's aide, Reinhard Spitzi, as saying, we were all Nazis. And of course, the question when one says that is, what is meant by that? What does it mean, we were all Nazis? Who were the we? Does it mean Nazi officials? Does it mean state officials, who were quite different from Nazi officials? Does it mean other direct beneficiaries of the regime? Or does it mean the Germans as a whole, most Germans, all Germans? There's a book that was published recently by a German scholar by the name of WWII, whose English translation is Hitler's Beneficiaries. And in that book, he argues that Hitler and his regime managed to bribe the German people by looting the rest of Europe and providing the goods to the German people. That is, the Germans supported the regime first and foremost, and especially during the war, because the standard of living was much higher than had been certainly in First World War and among many other countries. That, of course, excludes the United States, as we heard earlier today, but European countries. So this is one question that one needs to ponder a bit more. Who are the we when one says we were all Nazis? The second question has to do with commitment. What is meant by commitment to the regime? What does it mean I was or they were committed to the Nazi regime? Now, commitment meant different things to different people. Ali, as I said, spoke about collective bribery, not ideological conviction, but collective bribery. People simply felt that the regime made life good for them. Certainly in the 1930s, life for Germans improved dramatically. And during World War II, in the first few years of the war, these were years of triumph, of gain of great territories, and great material benefits to Germans. So it was not surprising that people supported the regime. It was, of course, a police state, but it was a police state for those people who seemed to the regime to be its opponents, whether they actually opposed it or whether they were defined by the regime as its enemies, whether they actually were or not. Homosexuals, the mentally and physically handicapped, Jews, all those people were not beneficiaries, obviously, but they were a minority within German society itself. Another historian, Robert Galately, Canadian-American historian, wrote a few years ago a book called Backing Hitler. That is a very interesting take on precisely this issue of what did it mean to have commitment to the regime. And his interpretation of the German police state is that Germans struck a kind of deal with the police state itself. That is, that they understood that if they worked together with the regime, they could get certain benefits from it, and particularly if they worked with the secret police, with the Gestapo. If one wanted one's neighbor's store, if one wanted to have, to improve one's career, to improve one's chances of promotion at the university, to improve one's chances to get a larger clientele as a dentist or a doctor, one had to denounce someone else. And if you went to the Gestapo and said, this neighbor of mine is either a Jew or a socialist or is having sexual relations with a Jew, then it was likely that those people would disappear and that you would get their store or you would get their clients. And as Galately showed, this was a widespread phenomenon to the extent that the Gestapo itself complained that it was getting too many denunciations from German citizens. So support for the regime or commitment for the regime or going along with the regime can mean different things for different people. Galately spoke about the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, as being a consensual dictatorship. It was a dictatorship, but most people, for most of the time, actually liked it and benefited from it. Now, of course, by 1945, the number of the supporters of the regime had greatly diminished because the regime was not doing very well. They were losing the war, their cities were being bombed. But still, we have to explain, and if you read, and I'm sure many of you have read Anthony Beevor's book on the Battle of Berlin, we have to understand what is it that made so many Germans still continue fighting for that regime until the very end, causing tremendous, horrendous casualties, of course, especially to the Red Army in the Battle of Berlin. And here there may be a combination of factors, and I'll just mention a few. One is, of course, lack of choice. And lack of choice was particularly prominent among those who were fighting for Hitler who were actually not German. As Anthony Beevor himself showed very clearly in his book on Berlin, I think one of the most interesting insights in this book is that many of the people who were fighting were SS troops that came from other countries. They were volunteers from other countries. They had no place to go to. they could not go back to England or to Norway or to the Netherlands or to Denmark where they came from because, of course, they would have been tried there. So they fought because there was nothing else to be done. There was also, of course, tremendous fear of the Soviets. German soldiers fought much better against the Soviets than they did against the Americans and the British. If they wanted to surrender, they tried to flee west, to fall prisoner to the Anglo-Americans, as they called them, because they knew they would be treated well. They could not expect such good treatment from the Red Army. But that too, that fear of the Soviets was based both on reality and on the fact that they had internalized a great deal of Nazi propaganda, that the Soviets were about to destroy the world, that the Soviets would kill them all, that they were beasts dressed as human beings. And so part of this fear of the Soviets had to do also with the fact that they had already succumbed to a great deal of Nazi propaganda. There were those, and one should not forget it, until the end, who remained committed to the regime. And they remained committed to the regime at least until Hitler committed suicide. And if we read many of the diaries left by young men and women, but particularly young men who were fighting for the regime as the Hitler Youth or as very young recruits, they were committed to the regime. And they admitted later on that it was only when Hitler committed suicide that this, so to speak, spell went away, that they finally realized after the great trauma of not only losing Germany, but losing the Fuhrer, that commitment was gone. So we should remember also that there was that commitment. And finally, and one finds that a great deal in accounts in the last months of the war and after the war, there were not a few Germans who continued fighting because they were afraid of what would happen to them, knowing and speaking about the fact that terrible crimes had been committed in their name and that there would be revenge against them. And that knowledge or that sense that they would have to come under the vengeance of the victorious Allies, speaking of the bombing of German cities as revenge for what was done to the Jews, that too made many Germans continue to fight long after it was clear that the war was over, that there was no way that they could win. So this is the first point that I wanted to talk about. The second follows from the first, and that is when we say how did Germany commit such atrocities, such barbarities, the country of Goethe and Schiller? Well, of course, one thing we have to ask is what atrocities, what barbarities? Many atrocities are committed in wartime. What is it precisely that we are talking about? And we are, of course, talking about massive war crimes and genocide. Those were not simply things that happened in the course of the war. Those were policies by the regime which were known to large parts of the leadership elements in the regime and those who were implementing these policies. And then we need to ask, what was it that motivated the people who carried out those crimes? Why were those who were in charge of them, and why were those who were right at the bottom motivated to carry out those crimes? Some of you may know of an important book by an historian called Christopher Browning, called Ordinary Men, in which he tries to analyze why German policemen, regular reserve policemen from Hamburg, killed tens of thousands of Jews, mostly by a shot to the head, one-on-one mass killing. What was it that motivated these men to act in such a way? They were policemen. They were not criminals. Their job before the war, and most of them after the war, was to go after criminals, not to be criminals themselves. And yet, they carried out these crimes, and he tries to understand what it is that motivated them. Let me move to the third issue, and that is regarding Germany facing up to its past. It is true in many ways that, precisely as Anthony Beaver has said, no country has done more to face up to the horrors of its own past. There's often a comparison made between Germany and Japan, and that Germany did its own memory work or its own remembering of its crimes in a much more thoroughgoing manner on all levels, commemoration, writing history, political rhetoric, restitution, and so forth. But I would simply suggest a few qualifications which I think are important, particularly in light of what I'll say in a moment regarding Germany as victim. In the 1990s, between 1995 and 1999, an exhibition was wandering around Germany which was called Crimes of the Wehrmacht, Crimes of the German Armed Forces. And that exhibition had over 1,000 photographs and many texts showing graphically crimes committed by soldiers of the armed forces, not the SS, not the police, but regular soldiers. The exhibition was seen by between 800,000 and 1 million Germans and Austrians. And it evoked a tremendous amount of political debate, and almost none of which was reported in the United States. But in Germany it was a major debate. There were even debates in parliament. There were members of the German parliament who broke down crying because they felt that their own fathers or grandfathers had been defamed by this exhibition. The exhibition closed in 1999. There was a debate about it that we can talk about later. And the question is, what is it that in the late 1990s made Germans so resistant to the idea that the German army had been involved in mass crimes, a fact that had been documented by German and other historians since the 1960s? What is it that made people, despite all this memory work, still refuse as a public to accept the fact that their fathers were members of what was ultimately a criminal organization that carried out criminal orders? This was another side of the great difficulty that Germany has facing its own past, even when we are no longer talking about most Germans having served in the Wehrmacht, having served in World War II, but their sons and daughters, grandchildren and grandsons and granddaughters. It is also, it needs to be remembered that in the early decades of the post-war period, German historiography and German political discourse was very careful regarding the way it spoke about German crimes. The term that was used officially, and in fact it still is used officially by the German government, is always crimes committed in the name of the German people. It never says who committed the crimes, it says they were committed in the name of the German people. So there is a taking of responsibility without an indication of who was actually responsible for the crimes. If you read histories of World War II, and I'm sure many of you have, if you read histories of Nazi Germany written in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the early to the mid-1970s, you will, for instance, hardly ever encounter anything about the Holocaust. You may find books on the Holocaust, although there were not many. But they will not be the same books that tell the story of World War II. One of the most important texts that I studied as a student at Oxford in the early 1980s was by a very prominent German historian by the name of Martin Borchardt, and it was called The Hitler State. And The Hitler State is a nice big book with many footnotes. It has one paragraph on what he calls the persecution of the Jews. And that is all that is devoted to this event. Now, this has changed a great deal, but that book came out in 1969. And it was written by a very important and influential scholar. And so we have to remember that this coming to terms has been both a very slow and painful process and has been a selective process. There were things that were more easy to come to terms with and others that people did not so easily come to terms with. Let me move to the... I have 10 minutes, right? To Germany as victim. Here too, there are interesting issues involved. I won't cite some of the books that have been published recently precisely on this issue. We can mention those later. But there is an interesting point that, in fact, already in the latter parts of the war, and immediately in the post-war period, that is between 1945 and 1949, when Germany does not exist yet as an independent state. It is an occupied country. There is a great deal of talk about Germany as a victim. And this has been documented over and over again. This is something that in the 1950s and 60s was entirely forgotten. Germans saw themselves, for obvious reasons, as victims of the war. Why would they not? Their cities were bombed, their men had either been killed or were prisoners of war. They had no time and no inclination to think about their own victims. They could only think about their own victimhood. They spoke about it, they wrote about it, they created an entire narrative of Germany as victim. The idea that only now Germany has been able to face up to its own victimhood is false. This began even before the war ended. And that's one issue that is important to remember. And that's why when we speak about such a book as Crab Walk, as Günter Grass's novel on the sinking of a boat of refugees, and the assertion made therein that finally, endlich, as the Germans would say, finally we can have a Schlussstrich, we can draw a line over that history and remember our own dead, our own victims. That term was a term that you could find already in 1945 being used. Finally, it is time that we stop talking about what we did to others and see our own victimhood. So it is an interesting process that the discourse itself talking about the fact that it is time that we talk about our victimhood has gone on since 1945. It is not something that began only now. Now, in this context, it's interesting to remember that Günter Grass has just published his memoir. Now, Günter Grass was, of course, as you know, the conscience of Germany after the war. And one of the things he liked most to do is to point out at all kinds of officials in the West German state who had been complicit in Nazi Germany. Well, it turned out that Günter Grass, for 60 years, had not exactly told the truth about himself. In fact, he was not only in the Hitler Youth and only in the Flakartillerie in anti-aircraft guns, as many young men were. In fact, he was in the Waffen-SS. And it took him a long time to admit it. And even when he writes about it in his memoir, he writes about it in a somewhat strange manner. Not least because he says that when I came to the Waffen-SS, it was full of foreigners. There were people from Denmark, there were people from Sweden, precisely the people that Anthony Beaver discovers in Berlin. Günter Grass also found in his own personal Waffen-SS unit. And he says, well, this was like a European army. So Günter Grass in 2006 tells us how he became a European by joining the Waffen-SS. And this is an interesting take on coming to terms with the past. Let me move quickly to the last 2 points so that we have some time for discussion. Who was the greatest criminal, Hitler or Stalin? Of course, there is no good answer for such questions, but let me propose the following. First, what is important, I think, constantly to point out, and Anthony Beaver just did, I believe, in his talk, is that for the Nazi regime, genocide was a goal. Genocide was the goal of Nazi policy. It was not a means to anything. It was a goal. For the Soviet regime under Stalin, mass murder of certain categories of people, and there can be a debate whether it was genocide or not, this would depend on how we define genocide, was a means to something else. It was not a goal on its own right. And that made a difference, not necessarily in numbers, because in numbers it has been calculated the communist regimes of all types during the 20th century have killed far more than the Nazis did. They also had a far longer period and were spread all over the world. That includes Cambodia, China, Vietnam, and many other countries. But what is important to remember is that there is a difference between a regime that is dedicated to genocide as a goal and a regime that ruthlessly implements its ideology, including the mass murder of people. But it is also important to remember, and this is something that is often forgotten, it should be said, especially here, that had it not been for the Soviet Union, under Stalin or someone else, it is very difficult to see how Nazi Germany would have been defeated. It is very difficult to see how the British or the Americans or the Canadians or the French would have been willing to sacrifice as many lives as did the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union did it both because it was a dictatorship and because Russians actually and others actually fought to liberate themselves from Nazi rule, which was particularly brutal there. And this is something that is often forgotten when one speaks about World War II in the United States. The problem with this is that Stalin was hardly a proponent of democracy, and that America was fighting a war for democracy with Stalin not just as an ally, not simply as a side show, but as the main theater of war. As Max Hastings may have said this morning, but wrote in any case, you know that even after D-Day, 10 times as many Germans were dying on the Eastern Front as were dying on the Western Front, even after the invasion. The invasion came quite late, so the proportions are heavily skewed. I have 3 minutes. I'll touch on collective guilt and normalization. This is an interesting issue. I've been lecturing in Germany about especially the German army for maybe 20 years. And I'm always asked by someone in the audience, so am I speaking now about collective guilt by Germany? And collective guilt, of course, is a concept that is quite meaningless because legally there is no such thing as collective guilt. You cannot put a nation on trial, as Nuremberg already showed. You have to put individuals on trial. But it is interesting that in Germany there's often been a denial of a charge that was not made, and that is a denial of a charge of collective guilt. The decision by the Allies at the end of World War II was not to speak about collective guilt. The decision by the United States, by Britain, by France, and by the Soviet Union was not to speak of collective German guilt. There were reasons for that, some better than others, some more political, some moral, but the fact of the matter was that Germany, in fact, was never accused of collective guilt, but rather certain institutions and certain individuals were seen as having been complicit in crimes. And this brings me to the last point that was also mentioned toward Anthony Beever's last end of his speech, which has to do with property. It is true, and it's interesting, that Germans now are beginning to look back at the territories that had once been German or had also had large German populations, and that there is an interest in purchasing land there, and that this is creating a fair amount of discomfort, to say the least, in countries such as Poland, the Czech Republic, and so forth. But there is one other element which brings us back to what I said at the beginning about bribing people. The Nazi regime bribed not only its own population, it bribed also many of the occupied populations, and it bribed them by giving them the property that belonged to others. It gave them the property of millions of Jews that it murdered. And those populations are still living in those same properties. Millions of people in Eastern Europe are living in stolen property. They didn't steal it themselves, of course, but they still live there. And that is also part of the legacy of the war, a legacy of millions of people who know that somehow they live in property that was taken away from people who themselves disappeared. Thank you.
I want to thank Professor Bartow for his very provocative analysis. And we'll now open the floor for questions. And also, Professor Beever, if you would like to respond to any of his comments, feel free to do so.
I can do that perhaps during the questions. That's
Good.
fine, yeah.
First question, please.
This question is for Dr. Bartow. About a dozen years ago, speaking to an American audience, and asked the question, how do you feel about Germany losing the war? Manfred Rommel, who was then Lord Mayor of Stuttgart, said, it was good that we lost the war. I'd like to know how prevalent that concept was at the time and how prevalent it might be now.
Thank you. That's a great question. Germans still talk even today about how to speak about the end of the war. There was a very famous speech by the German president in 1985 in which he spoke precisely about this. Weizsäcker at the time, Richard Weizsäcker. The Germans, although they lost the war, they should also see it as liberation, because they were liberated from the Nazi regime. But one cannot say that most Germans in 1945 felt that way, and it took 40 years until Weizsäcker could actually, as head of state, could articulate that publicly.
Next question, please.
One of the biggest mistakes Hitler made in World War II was persecuting the Jews. They were very brilliant people, very brilliant scientists. What would have happened to our world if he would have used their knowledge and been the first country to get the atomic bomb? Where would we be in history today, or would we even exist anymore?
I think one of the fascinating things I came across was this Schaeff report at the end of the war based on interrogations of senior German officers. And many of these German officers were saying they would, of course, never admit to any crime. They said, we made mistakes. And several of them actually said, we made mistakes by persecuting the Jews because otherwise they could have made us some really good weapons, including, no doubt, the atomic bomb. So,
No, I just want to add, I was told, and Anthony Beaver may correct me, that Montgomery would start his first talk to cadets at Sandhurst by saying the first rule that any British officer should know is never invade Russia. Now, Hitler had to invade Russia because this was Hitler's ideology. The Nazi regime, without persecuting the Jews, would not have been the Nazi regime. So it is a counter-historical question. It would have been a different kind of regime, and we would have lived in a different world today.
Question, please.
I am Arto Palkama from Finland. My question is to Professor Beaver concerning the day of Overlord. According to the agreement between the American and British leaders and Stalin was that at the same time as they do the Operation Overlord, Russia starts a major attack on the Eastern Front. But as we all know, there was no major attack at all. Instead, Russia attacked Finland with an army which was bigger than the American-British army in Operation Overlord. It was composed of 150,000 soldiers. And we were really in trouble for 1 week, but thanks to Operation Overlord, we were able to stop this Russian army and destroy it partly. And then Stalin was in hurry to send these soldiers to Eastern Front to run to Berlin before Americans come there. But my question is that what was the reaction in the high command of the American-British army when they noticed this betrayal of Stalin?
I'm sorry, I don't agree with you because, in fact, Stalin had launched Operation Bagration, which was the biggest and the most effective operation of the whole war. I mean, he destroyed and surrounded the whole of Army Group Center.
You see, this was on 9th of June 1944,
Yes.
3 days after the Operation Overlord. And it was the original plan, I think, was that he should have attacked the Germans and not the Finns.
Well, I'm sorry. I mean, it was one of, as I say. I mean, Bagration was one of the biggest operations of the war. I can't understand how you're saying that there was no operation. Yes, troops moved on Finland. That's certainly true. But that was nothing in comparison to Bagration, which was the most effective operation.
Well, okay.
Next question, please.
About a year or so ago, my wife and I went to Berlin to see the new Holocaust Memorial. I wonder if either of you have seen it. Probably yes. Both of you have. We found it to be the most powerful experience we've ever seen involving the Holocaust. and I was curious as to what the two of you thought of it also.
Well, I saw it near completion about a year ago, I believe, or just less than a year ago, and I will see it in about 4 weeks. Yes, it's extraordinary. To my mind, what is extraordinary about it are two other things. A is the debate around it. As you know, there was a debate that lasted at least a decade over whether it should be built and then how it should look. And that debate, as such, was an extraordinarily important public debate within Germany itself. And I think that played a role because it is extraordinary that a nation builds a memorial to its victims. That's not a common phenomenon, right? And secondly, the location. It is in the heart of Berlin. It is between the Reichstag, Hitler's old bunker, where the American embassy is going to go up, where the Brandenburg Tor is, everything is there. And so the statement of that is that this is an integral part of German identity. And I think that is a very important issue. As to its design, people have different opinions, whether it's going to be a playground or does it look like a cemetery, but that's another aesthetic issue.
Interestingly, I think there was almost as much debate or even more debate in the Reichstag over leaving Red Army soldiers' graffiti, which had been put there on the walls when they arrived in 1945. And there were many German Bundestag deputies who were actually far more upset about that.
Yeah, that's true.
Next question, please.
To both speakers, from a philosophical standpoint, from what I gathered what you were speaking about, that this is more of a war between, let's say, Nietzsche versus, let's say, Engels and Marx or Lenin, from a philosophical standpoint, rather than these two big egotistical giants who were perhaps a byproduct of those philosophical thoughts. Did the people actually have that same type of idea, or that was way beyond their understandings, and the fact that Nietzsche was looking for some sort of superhero to take the Germans to beyond the French socialism or the Anglo-American democracies? And if that's the case, then really we were then secondary to this whole philosophical battle, not just a ideological battle, but a philosophical battle. Would that be safe to say that you're in a sense important?
Look, I mean, the Nazis had a certain interpretation of Nietzsche, but that was not Nietzsche. So you could say that Nazism was in part also a misinterpretation and distortion of Nietzsche. So added to which was racism, social Darwinism, a whole lot of other things that were not at all part of Nietzsche, even if you really try to distort him. No, I wouldn't say that the Germans were fighting for Nietzsche. Nietzsche was spinning in his grave by the very idea that people like Hitler, would see him as an ally. The Soviets, I do think, from my readings, that there was a very strong combination in the Soviet Union of Russian patriotism and other patriotisms, such as Ukrainian and so forth, and Soviet identity. And that people actually often, at that point, started seeing themselves as Soviet citizens. That disintegrated later on. But I think there was a sense of nationalism to which was combined Soviet identity, which was closely linked and could not exist without a Marxist underpinning. So in that sense, yes, I think the Soviet case is stronger.
I think Nazism, as we all know, was the most extraordinary hodgepodge, and Hitler was obviously a very superficial intellectual who liked sort of pushing a whole lot of things together. I mean, you might even say there were sort of elements of Wagnerianism in it. And the other thing, which I think is perhaps something where historians should look a little bit further, is Hitler's obsession with the cinema. And I think it's actually terrifying the way that he probably saw himself as a great director of a great epic. Stalin, too, was another movie addict, and I think perhaps one should inquire, perhaps even in elections, of future presidents and prime ministers, in fact, of quite how obsessed they are with the movies. So it's just one area. It's just one area of
Cinematic taste.
cinematic taste and all the rest of it. As far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I think what is very striking, I agree entirely with Omar about the development of the Soviet identity during the war, but it was very striking, of course, at the beginning of the war, that they were starting to invoke such proletarian heroes as Alexander Nevsky and Kutuzov and all the rest of it, i.e. Stalin did not trust the symbol of the Soviet Union or communism to inspire the people. And so he went back to old Russian patriotism, and that was when there was sort of the rather spurious re-legalization of the Orthodox Church and all of these other elements. But the idea that, shoulder boards were being reintroduced in late 42, that there was the order of Suvorov and the order of Suvorov and the order of Kutuzov being introduced for the Red Army was a very, very striking paradox. But as I was saying, I think that partly due to this particular element, yes, the Soviet identity did start to grow up. But at the same time, one must remember that Stalin encouraged the rumors within the Red Army, because the soldiers at the front thought, with the defeat of Germany, we're not going to need the NKVD anymore. We're not going to need these trials of Trotsky as fascists and all the rest of it. We'll be able to have an open society. We can get rid of the hated collective farms and all the rest of it. Well, one cannot prove it, but I mean, it certainly seems that the Soviet authorities almost slightly encouraged these rumors. They certainly didn't crack down on them at the front. But of course, they then cracked down in late 44 and 1945, when almost 3 times as many soldiers and officers were arrested for anti-Soviet remarks during the first 5 months of 1945, as had been during the previous 2 years. So it gave one an idea. Stalin was suddenly cracking down again right at the end.
I'm looking a little bit for your help in helping a layman sort through the dilemma of when a people redefines itself, particularly toward or from its victims' perspectives, as not being what we were seen in a previous generation to be. And you have referred to this, and other speakers have too, as the almost lack of nationalism experienced by a generation of Germans to follow those of World War II. You are sitting now in New Orleans, Louisiana, when many of us are dealing with dynamics of being the descendants of slaveholders and how that plays out vis-a-vis those who were, so to speak, our victims in previous centuries. This plays out, of course, now with the dilemma of the European Union's dilemma and whether to admit Turkey into the Union, because they are saying we are not the Turks of the Ottoman Empire, and therefore the horrors of the Armenian genocide should not be visited on us now. We should not assume that mantle. How do we deal with this when we are evolving, as I hope we are, to be better as a people, as a civilization, when we carry baggage with us? Is a way to find our, I guess what we're wanting is acceptance and let old bygones be bygones between the perpetrators and the victims, but of course it plays out worldwide. How do you, as historians, help us deal with that, because it plays out politically and also on an everyday basis around the world?
That's, of course, that's a very difficult question to answer, but it gives me an opportunity to plug Brown University, which has just issued a report called Slavery and Justice. And I had the privilege of being on the committee that researched and wrote this report for 3 years. That is a report that deals with Brown University's own complicity in slavery at its founding. And it is an attempt to talk precisely about these issues. How do we face up to crimes that were committed in the past, that we ourselves had nothing to do with, and yet they are part of the historical record, and they are in some part, in some way, part of the legacy that we inherited. This is one of the questions. Can you say that you're a German in 2006 and your identity is only Beethoven and Schiller and Hitler is not part of your history. Can you say that you're a professor at Brown University, you may not have even been born in America, let alone have lived at the time of slavery, and yet that you will benefit from what it is, and you will disown everything that you don't like about its past? So I think that as a general a moral statement, if we want to be not just proud of our past, but if we want to be part of our past, if we want to be part of a legacy, then we have to take all of it. And the only way that we can do it is to bring it out. And this is what people spoke about eloquently in Germany for many years. Not all the time, but people spoke precisely about this, that you can be a German, and you can be a proud German, only if you can confront the past. If you hide it, if you try to do what Turkey has been doing, then you will never have a stable, healthy, normal national identity.
One quick example, in fact, of a country being snagged on its past was very much a question of Spain and the Spanish Civil War. This year being the 70th anniversary, a huge debate. The trouble is the present government under Zapatero felt in a way that one can understand the imbalance. The leftists who were executed by the right left in unmarked graves, while the right who had been killed by the left were all turned into martyrs and all the rest of it. But the trouble is, when you try to legislate, and they've just brought in this law for the recuperation of historical memory, you're actually, in fact, in this case, provoking the left and also provoking the right. Nobody is happy by the law. And as quite a lot of the critics, from both sides politically, have said, you know, this has got to be opened up, and it's got to be a debate for historians or anybody else who's, if you like, interested in history. I do not think that the state can start to intervene in that particular way, because it's never going to satisfy anybody in that way.
I'm going to have to call time. I beg your pardon. I hope you two gentlemen would come forward and ask the questions individually. And I would ask all of you to join me in thanking our panel for a great session. Thank you.